All right, so you're in philosophy. Well, let's dive into a question that's, well, it's both deeply personal and surprisingly slippery. What is consciousness?
It's a big one, for sure.
We're going deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for this one, trying to get a handle on this age-old mystery. And I got to admit, even a quick skim, it left me with more questions than answers.
It's a question that's captivated thinkers for centuries, really. And the Stanford Encyclopedia, it does a fantastic job laying out just how complex it all is. It's not just about, like, defining consciousness. It's about, understanding how we even think about it, the different ways we approach the problem, and of course, the challenges we face trying to explain this, well, this fundamental part of our existence.
Yeah, one thing that really jumped out at me was just how many different meanings are packed into this one word, consciousness. It's not a simple concept, like table or chair.
Right, exactly. The encyclopedia highlights this beautifully. We use consciousness to talk about, well, is a creature awake and aware? Can it feel pain? Does it have a sense of self?
Right, right. And then there's this whole other level of what they call state consciousness. So, like, are you aware of your current mental states? Things like what philosophers call qualia.
Qualia, yeah.
Those subjective, qualitative experiences that are just so hard to pin down.
It's that what it's like aspect that always gets me, like we can describe a bat's echolocation system, objectively, all the science behind it, but we'll never truly know what it feels like to experience the world through sonar.
Precisely. Thomas Nagel, he really nailed this with his famous bat analogy.
Oh, yeah.
And it really highlights a key challenge in studying consciousness, this inherent gap between objective descriptions and, well, and the subjective experience.
Yeah.
So one thing to analyze brain activity, but quite another to grasp, the first-person perspective of what it's like to be that brain,
Yeah.
experiencing the world.
And it's not just about being a bat, right? There's also this idea of being conscious of something, this transitive consciousness the encyclopedia mentions. To be honest, that one tripped me up a little. Yeah, it's a bit more subtle than just being conscious in general, right?
Right.
Think of it this way. You're conscious right now, but you're also conscious of our conversation, conscious of the thoughts you're having about consciousness. So that directed awareness, that consciousness of something specific, that's what transitive consciousness is getting at.
Okay, that makes more sense. So we've already got these like different layers of meaning.
Yeah.
But it sounds like humans have been wrestling with the nature of consciousness for a very, very long time.
Oh, absolutely. The encyclopedia even points out that, Neolithic burial practices,
Yeah.
they suggest maybe some level of pondering about what happens to the mind, to the self after death.
Wow.
Those elaborate rituals, the care taken in preparing bodies for burial, it hints at, well, at an awareness that there might be something more to us than just, flesh and bone.
So it's like even without a specific word for consciousness, our ancestors were already grappling with this idea of a mind that could exist separately from the body.
It's a fascinating possibility for sure. And, that takes us to ancient Greece. That's where the debate about consciousness really starts to heat up. Some scholars argue that the Greeks, despite their incredible, philosophical advancements, they didn't actually have a direct equivalent to our modern concept of consciousness. And they point to the fact that there wasn't really a specific word for it in the Greek language.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So even brilliant minds like Plato and Aristotle, they might have had a fundamentally different way of thinking about the mind.
It's a possibility, and it really challenges our assumptions about about the universality of human experience.
Yeah.
Others, though, argue that the Greeks, even without a single word for it, they were engaged in discussions that really touched upon key aspects of what we now call consciousness.
Okay.
So they debated the nature of perception, the relationship between mind and body, and even the possibility of a soul that transcends the physical.
Okay, so maybe it's not about having the exact same word, but more about like wrestling with these similar questions about the nature of mind and self.
Right.
But then there's this shift, right? This turning inward, focusing on consciousness as like the core of thought.
Exactly. And thinkers like Descartes and Locke back in the 17th century, they played a huge role in that shift.
Oh, yeah.
Descartes' famous, I think, therefore I am, it really put consciousness front and center, right at the heart of our being. He argued that, well, the only thing we can be absolutely certain of is our own existence as thinking beings.
And Locke, I mean, he had different views on, what consciousness actually is, but he also considered it essential to like personal identity and thought, right?
Absolutely. He saw consciousness as this continuous thread that, connects our experiences over time, forming the basis of who we are as individuals. And what's really interesting is that even back then there were critiques. of this idea that consciousness could be explained purely through matter.
Hmm.
Leibniz, for example, he used this brilliant analogy to make that point.
Oh, yeah, the mill analogy, right.
Exactly.
I remember that from my philosophy classes.
Such a vivid image.
Yeah, yeah.
You walk through this giant mill, seeing all the gears and mechanisms, everything in action, but no matter how closely you look, you can't find consciousness anywhere in those physical processes.
Right. It's like you can see all the parts, but the mind is somehow missing.
Exactly. Leibniz argued that the mind isn't just a product of, these material interactions, but something distinct. It has its own unique properties. And it's a challenge that still haunts us today when we try to explain consciousness purely in physical terms.
So even centuries ago, philosophers were already hitting up against some of the core problems we're still wrestling with today. And the Stanford Encyclopedia, it lays out these 3 big questions that really get to the heart of it all. What is consciousness? How does it come to exist? And why does it even exist?
Those are the fundamental questions, absolutely. And you'll notice they're all kind of intertwined. You can't really answer one without grappling with the others.
Okay, so let's try to tackle the what question. Now, I know we've already touched on this a bit, but the encyclopedia really emphasizes this need for both introspection and empirical data to really understand consciousness.
Right.
It can't just be about armchair philosophizing, right?
You got it. Introspection, that looking inward at our own experiences, it's essential. But it's only one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
We also need objective, third-person perspectives, the kind of data we get from neuroscience, psychology, and cognitive science.
It's like I can spend all day thinking about what it's like to see the color red, but that won't actually tell me anything about, the actual neural processes happening in my brain that are making that experience possible.
Exactly. And studying those neural processes, it can actually reveal things we might not be aware of through introspection alone. For example, there's been research on brain damage.
Oh, wow.
And they found that very specific lesions can lead to very specific disruptions in consciousness. And that gives us valuable insights into, how different brain regions actually contribute to different aspects of experience.
That's fascinating. So it's about combining that, what it's like, with how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And the encyclopedia outlines these 7 key features of consciousness that any theory has to grapple with.
Yeah.
I got to say, some of these are pretty mind-bending, like qualitative character,
Mm-hmm.
those raw feels
Yeah.
that are so central to our experience, but just so hard to explain.
Yes, the infamous qualia. It's one thing to say that a tomato is red, but it's quite another to really grasp that subjective, qualitative experience of redness. And it raises some seriously perplexing questions, like, could it be that what you experience as red, I experience as blue, even though we both learned to call it red? That possibility of inverted qualia, it's a real philosophical puzzle.
Invaded qualia. Whoa, that's wild. It's like we're both looking at the same strawberry, but our internal experiences are totally different.
Exactly.
But we'd never know because we've both learned to use the same word to describe it.
Precisely. It really highlights how deeply subjective qualia are and the challenges of bridging that gap between, the subjective experience and an objective description.
Okay, so we've got qualitative character, and then there's subjectivity, which seems closely related. This idea that certain facts about experience can only be understood from the inside, from the perspective of the experiencer.
Exactly. And that's why Nagel's bat analogy is so relevant here.
Yeah.
We can objectively study the bat's brain, its echolocation system, all of that, but we can never truly grasp what it feels like to be that bat, experiencing the world through sonar. That subjective aspect, it remains elusive to any external observer.
So even if we had, like, a complete map of the brain, there might still be something about subjective experience that just eludes, like, a scientific explanation.
It's a possibility that a lot of philosophers take very seriously, but there are 5 other key features the encyclopedia lists, and they all add layers of complexity to this whole problem of consciousness. We have phenomenal structure, how those raw feels are actually organized into, coherent experiences. Then self-perspectuality, which is that sense that our experiences are always from a particular point of view, the point of view of the self.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how all these features are kind of intertwined. It's not just about the raw feels, it's about how those feels are structured, how they relate to a sense of self, and how they create like a unified experience of the world.
Exactly. And that brings us to unity, the fact that our experiences aren't just a jumble of disconnected sensations.
Yeah.
They're integrated into a cohesive whole. Think about it. At any given moment, you're experiencing sights, sounds, smells, feelings, thoughts,
We haven't sound.
but it all
Yeah.
comes together in this single unified experience of the world.
Yeah, it's like all those different sensory inputs are being woven together into like a seamless tapestry of experience.
Precisely. And then there's intentionality and transparency. Intentionality is this idea that our conscious states are always about something. So, like, when I think about that strawberry, my thought is directed toward the strawberry. It has a kind of aboutness. And transparency refers to how we often experience the world directly without really being aware of our own mental representations.
So like when I see a tree, I don't stop and think, oh, I'm having a visual experience of a tree. I just experience the tree itself.
Right.
But some philosophers argue that this transparency is actually an illusion, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a debate about whether we truly have, unmediated access to the world or whether our perceptions are always filtered through these mental representations.
Okay, so it's like, are we seeing reality directly? Or is it more like we're watching a movie of reality projected by our minds?
A great way to put it. And finally, there's dynamic flow. William James, he famously described consciousness as a stream, constantly changing, evolving, flowing from one moment to the next.
It's always moving?
Right. And yet, there's also this coherence to that flow. Our experiences are interconnected, each one arising from those that came before. It's not just, a random jumble of sensations and thoughts.
So even though our experiences are always changing, there's a sense of continuity, like a narrative thread that runs through them.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that brings us to the how question. And this is where things really start to get complicated. How does this incredible, complex phenomenon of consciousness even exist?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And as the Stanford Encyclopedia points out, it's actually a whole family of questions, really.
Okay.
Like, are we trying to explain access consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, or something else entirely? And then, what even counts as a successful explanation?
And is consciousness even explainable at all? I mean, is there something about it that just fundamentally defies explanation, that makes it just resistant to, like, scientific inquiry?
It's a concern that some philosophers definitely raise. They point to what's called the explanatory gap. It's this, seemingly insurmountable difficulty of bridging the subjective experience of consciousness with, objective scientific explanations. How do we get from neurons firing to the feeling of what it's like to see the color red?
Right.
It's a tough nut to crack, and some argue that it might be impossible to crack using just the tools of science alone.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. But I mean, some philosophers are more optimistic, right?
Yeah.
They believe that consciousness is ultimately a product of physical processes in the brain, even if we don't fully understand how yet.
Exactly. And there's a huge variety of approaches to explaining how consciousness might arise from the physical world. Some focus on neural processes, others on computational organization, and then there are some who even venture into the realm of quantum mechanics.
Hold on, quantum mechanics. As in, consciousness is somehow connected to, like, the weirdness of subatomic particles. That sounds pretty far out there.
It might sound a bit far-fetched, but there are some serious physicists and philosophers who believe that quantum mechanics might actually hold the key to unlocking these mysteries of consciousness. They argue that, classical physics, with its deterministic laws and its focus on material interactions, it might not be the right tool for understanding something as subjective and seemingly non-physical as consciousness.
Okay, so that's definitely pushing the boundaries of my understanding. But before we spiral down that rabbit hole, let's maybe get back to this idea of explanation itself.
Mhm.
I mean, do we need like a strict deductive explanation for consciousness? Or is it okay to have, a looser, more general understanding of how it might be connected to the physical world?
That's a fantastic question. It gets to the heart of the debate between, reductive and non-reductive explanations.
Right.
So reductive explanations, they aim to fully explain a phenomenon in terms of its underlying components. Think about water. We can fully explain its properties in terms of, the properties of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. But some people argue that consciousness might not be amenable to that kind of, reductionist explanation.
So it's like, even if we knew absolutely everything about neurons and how they interact, we still wouldn't be able to fully explain the feeling of what it's like to see red.
That's the challenge that non-reductive explanations are trying to address. They acknowledge that consciousness might have these emergent properties that can't be fully captured by just reducing it to its physical components.
Okay, I'm starting to see the different ways philosophers are approaching this how question, but it's a lot to wrap my head around.
It definitely is. And the debate, well, it's far from settled. Whether we'll ultimately be able to explain consciousness in a way that satisfies both philosophers and scientists, it remains an open question. But the ongoing quest to understand consciousness, it's one of the most exciting and intellectually stimulating endeavors in human history, I think.
I agree. And it leads us to that final big question, the why. Why does consciousness exist at all? Does it have a function, a purpose? Is it just like a cosmic accident? Or is there a reason why we evolved to have these rich, subjective experiences?
The why question is all about the value and the role of consciousness. Does it make a difference to the organisms that possess it? And if so, how and why?
And if consciousness is a product of evolution, as many believe, then understanding its function, well, it might give us clues about how it arose in the first place.
Precisely. So let's consider some possible functions of consciousness. Perhaps the most basic question is whether consciousness even has any causal impact at all.
Okay.
Some philosophers and scientists have argued that consciousness might actually be epiphenomenal, just a byproduct of brain activity with no real influence on our actions or behavior.
Wait, so you're saying that, like, my conscious thoughts and feelings might not actually be doing anything? That's a pretty radical idea. It goes against everything we, like, intuitively believe about ourselves.
It is radical. It really challenges the common sense view that our conscious experiences are actually what drive our actions. But it's a possibility that we need to take seriously if we're going to be honest about the challenges of understanding consciousness.
Okay, let's say that consciousness does have causal powers.
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of difference does it make? What are some of the proposed functions that, philosophers and scientists have come up with?
Well, one possibility is that consciousness, it enhances our flexibility and control over our actions. We know that unconscious processes can be incredibly efficient, but they tend to be pretty fixed, inflexible. Consciousness, on the other hand, it allows us to adapt to new situations, to think creatively, and to override our automatic responses when we need to.
So it's like consciousness gives us free will.
The relationship between consciousness and free will, it's a complex one. It's hotly debated, but it's certainly true that consciousness seems to be a prerequisite for that kind of, deliberate, reasoned decision-making that we associate with free will. It lets us step back from our immediate impulses, consider different options, and make choices based on our values and beliefs.
That makes sense. What are some other potential functions of consciousness?
Another possibility is that consciousness plays a crucial role in social coordination. Think about it. Our ability to understand and predict the behavior of other people, it relies on our capacity for theory of mind.
Theory of mind. Yeah.
That ability to, attribute mental states to others. And that capacity, it seems very closely linked to our own conscious self-awareness.
So by being conscious of our own thoughts and feelings, we're actually better able to understand the thoughts and feelings of others. That makes sense. It's like we're using our own internal experiences as a model for understanding the minds of those around us.
Exactly. And that shared understanding of minds is what allows for, complex social interactions, cooperation, communication. It's what allows us to build relationships, to navigate these complex social hierarchies, and to create cultures and societies.
It seems like consciousness is doing a lot of heavy lifting. What other functions have been proposed?
Well, some argue that consciousness, it allows for this more unified and integrated representation of reality. Our conscious experiences, they present us with this world of objects existing in space and time, with this rich tapestry of sights, sounds, smells, and feelings all woven together.
And that integrated representation of the world, it allows us to interact with it in more sophisticated ways, right?
Precisely. It allows for flexible, goal-directed behavior that goes beyond just simple stimulus-response reactions. It allows us to plan for the future, to anticipate the consequences of our actions, and to navigate complex environments.
So it's like consciousness is what allows us to live in a world of meaning and purpose, to make sense of our experiences, and to actually pursue our goals.
It certainly seems to play a crucial role in all of those things.
Okay, we're making good progress. What are the last couple of functions we need to cover?
Well, there's the idea that consciousness enables global informational access. Think about it. The information contained in our conscious thoughts and experiences, it's available for use by a wide variety of mental processes.
Okay.
It can be used to guide our actions, to make decisions, to form memories, to communicate with others.
Right.
Unconscious information, on the other hand, tends to be more localized and specialized. It's not as readily available.
So it's like consciousness is this ultimate multitasker. It's bringing together information from all these different parts of our minds and making it available for, whatever we need to do.
That's a great way to put it. And finally, there's the intrinsic motivation function. This idea focuses on the fact that certain conscious states, especially emotional states, seem to have motivational power kind of built right into them. Think about the feeling of pleasure or pain. Those feelings, they're not just information, they also actually motivate us to approach or avoid certain things.
So it's like pleasure feels good and makes us want to seek out more of whatever caused it.
Yeah.
And pain feels bad and makes us want to avoid whatever caused it.
Exactly. The idea is that those motivational forces, they're intrinsic to the conscious experience itself. They're not just tacked on afterward. They're a fundamental part of what it means to have those experiences.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the what, the how, and even the why of consciousness. But I have a feeling we're just scratching the surface, right? There's a whole world of specific theories and philosophical debates that we haven't even touched on yet.
You're absolutely right. The study of consciousness is vast and multifaceted. But hopefully, this deep dive has given you a solid foundation for further exploration.
It definitely has. And I'm eager to keep learning more. So what's next on our consciousness journey?
Well, now that we've explored those big questions, it's time to delve into the specific theories that philosophers and scientists have proposed to try and explain consciousness. And trust me, things are about to get even more interesting. Get ready for a whirlwind tour of theories, each trying to make sense of how consciousness fits into the world. We'll start with the big picture stuff, the metaphysics, before zooming in on specific models.
Okay, bring on the metaphysics. It sounds like we're going back to that age-old debate of dualism versus physicalism. Is consciousness a separate substance from the physical world, or is it ultimately a product of matter?
Exactly. Dualism, in a nutshell, says that the mind and body are fundamentally distinct. Think of it like Descartes' view, the mental realm. It exists independently of the physical.
So like a ghost in the machine, to use Gilbert Ryle's famous phrase.
Yeah, it's a tempting image, though modern dualists are a bit more nuanced than that. Some argue for property dualism, so the idea that, conscious properties exist, but they're not reducible to physical properties. It's not about separate substances, but about distinct kinds of properties.
But if those conscious properties aren't physical, what are they? It's easy to say they're different, but that doesn't really explain anything.
That's the million-dollar question, and dualists they have different answers. Some propose that conscious properties are fundamental, like the laws of physics, or just, part of the basic fabric of reality. Others suggest they might emerge from complex physical systems, though how that emergence happens is still a mystery.
Okay, so dualism leaves us with some pretty big mysteries. What about physicalism? That's the camp that says consciousness is ultimately a product of the physical world, right?
Right, but even within physicalism, there's like a whole spectrum of views.
Okay.
On one end, you have the eliminativists, a pretty radical bunch. They argue that consciousness, as we typically conceive of it, it doesn't actually exist.
Wait, so they're saying we're not actually conscious. That seems, a bit hard to swallow.
It does sound counterintuitive, but the more extreme eliminativists argue that our talk of consciousness is based on this flawed folk psychology. It's like this set of pre-scientific concepts that will eventually be replaced by a more accurate, purely physical description of the brain.
So it's like they're saying, we're not conscious, we just think we are.
In essence, yes, though most eliminativists are a bit more moderate, targeting specific features like qualia or the self as illusory. They argue that these concepts, they don't actually refer to anything real in the world and will eventually be eliminated from our scientific understanding of the mind.
That's still a pretty radical idea. What about the less extreme physicalists? Where do they stand on this?
Well, there's good old identity theory, which says that mental states are identical to brain states. Your experience of red, for example, is simply a particular pattern of neural firing in your brain.
That seems pretty straightforward. But, doesn't that run into problems when we consider that different brains might experience things differently? Like, my brain and a bat's brain are structured quite differently, yet we both experience the world.
You've hit on a key objection to identity theory, the multiple realizability argument. The idea is that the same mental state, like experiencing red, could be realized in different ways across different brains, even different species.
Right.
So a strict one-to-one identity between mental states and brain states, well, it might not hold up.
Okay, so strict identity might be too rigid of a view. What are some other options on the table? Functionalism.
Functionalism is a popular contender. It shifts the focus from what mental states are made of to what they do.
Okay.
So mental states, according to functionalism, are defined by their functional roles, their causal relations to inputs, outputs, and other mental states.
So it's like saying a conscious state is kind of like a software program that can run on different hardware. The same program can run on a PC, a Mac, a smartphone. It's the function that matters, not the physical implementation.
Exactly. And that makes functionalism pretty appealing because it allows for the possibility of consciousness in systems that are physically different from us, like AI. But of course, functionalism has its critics too.
Right.
Some argue that it can't account for the subjective feel of consciousness, those qualia we were talking about earlier. How can a purely functional description capture what it's actually like to experience something?
It seems like every theory we encounter has its strengths and weaknesses. It's hard to imagine one single view capturing all the complexities of consciousness.
That's a common sentiment. Each perspective seems to highlight a different aspect of the problem, but none quite seems to grasp the whole picture. But that's part of what makes the study of consciousness so intriguing, I think.
So we've covered the big picture views, the metaphysical stances on consciousness. What about the more specific theories, the ones that try to actually provide detailed models of how consciousness works?
Let's dive into those. We'll start with higher order theories, which put self-awareness at the center of the stage.
Okay, higher order theories. I remember encountering those in my philosophy studies. The basic idea is that to be conscious of something, you need to have a thought about that something, right?
You got it. It's like having a thought about your own thoughts, a perception of your own perceptions. Higher order theories, they argue that this kind of metamental awareness is what makes a mental state conscious.
So if I'm not aware of having a particular thought or feeling, then it's not conscious. It's kind of lurking in the background of my mind, but it doesn't enter the spotlight of awareness.
Exactly. There are different versions of this theory. Some say the higher order state is a thought, others say it's more like an inner perception. But the core idea is that consciousness requires this second order level of awareness, this kind of self-reflexivity.
But isn't it a bit strange to think that we need like a separate thought or perception to make another mental state conscious? It seems to add an unnecessary layer of complexity.
It's a common criticism for sure.
Right.
Critics point out that having a thought about something doesn't usually make that thing conscious. Like thinking about a tree doesn't make the tree conscious, right?
Right.
So why should it be any different for mental states?
Good point. So how do higher order theorists respond to that objection?
They argue that mental states are different. They say there's something special about being aware of your own mental states that gives rise to consciousness. Maybe it's the self-referential nature of those higher order thoughts or perceptions. Maybe it's something else entirely. But they maintain that this meta level of awareness, it's crucial for subjective experience.
Okay, I can see how that response might work, though. I'm not entirely convinced. But let's move on to another type of theory. What about representationalism? I've heard that term thrown around, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
Representationalism, it puts the idea of mental representation front and center. It claims that all conscious states are representational states, so they're about something in the world or about our own internal states.
So if I see a red apple, my conscious experience is simply a representation of that apple, with all its properties, including its redness. There's nothing more to it than that.
Exactly. For representationalists, that's all there is to consciousness. It's all about representations. They say qualia, that subjective feeling of what it's like, is either an illusion or simply a part of the representation itself.
But doesn't that kind of ignore the fact that our experiences actually feel like something? It seems like representationalism is reducing conscious experience to just this set of dry, abstract symbols, whereas the feeling, the richness, the immediacy of experience.
It's a common criticism, for sure. Opponents of representationalism argue that it fails to capture that, the phenomenal character of experience, that what its likeness that Nadel talked about. They say simply representing the world isn't enough to actually explain the subjective feel of being a conscious being.
Okay, I could see both sides of that argument. It's like
Right.
there's this fundamental gap between between the representational content of our experiences and the way those experiences actually feel from the inside. But I'm curious about some of the other specific theories out there. What else should we be aware of?
Well, one that's gained a lot of traction in recent years is the global workspace theory developed by Bernard Bars. It uses this kind of theater analogy to try to explain consciousness, which can be a pretty helpful way to visualize what's going on.
A theater analogy. That sounds intriguing. Tell me more. I'm always up for a good analogy.
Imagine a stage where all these different mental processes are kind of vying for the spotlight. The processes that make it to the stage, that become the focus of attention, well, those are the ones we become conscious of. And those conscious contents, they're then kind of broadcast globally throughout the brain, making them available for use by other mental systems.
So it's like consciousness is the spotlight that illuminates certain mental contents, making them accessible to the rest of the brain.
Yeah.
And everything else is happening backstage out of the conscious spotlight.
Exactly. And the global workspace theory, it's been pretty influential in neuroscience,
Right.
with researchers identifying specific brain regions that might correspond to this global workspace.
That's really cool. It starts to bridge the gap between like these abstract philosophical ideas and the concrete neural mechanisms. It's starting to feel like we're getting closer to a scientific understanding of consciousness. What about other scientific approaches? What about neural theories?
Neural theories, they aim to explain consciousness in terms of, specific brain processes. A lot of research focuses on trying to identify what they call the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCCs. So it's basically the specific neural activity that corresponds to particular conscious experiences. It's about finding the neural footprints of conscious experience.
So like if you're looking at a red apple, researchers would try to find the exact pattern of neural firing that corresponds to your experience of seeing that apple.
Exactly. And there are tons of different neural theories out there, each focusing on different brain regions and processes. Some focus on the role of the thalamus, kind of like this relay station in the brain. Others on cortical activity, those complex interactions in the outer layer of the brain. And still others on synchronized oscillations across different brain areas, those rhythmic firing patterns that might kind of bind different aspects of experience together.
It seems like there's so much exciting research happening in neuroscience, trying to really pinpoint, the neural basis of consciousness. But what about those who are skeptical that we can explain consciousness just in terms of brain activity? What about the quantum theorists we talked about earlier?
Quantum theories of consciousness are definitely on the more speculative end of the spectrum. They propose that consciousness might actually be connected to quantum phenomena, those, strange and counterintuitive processes that govern the behavior of subatomic particles.
Okay, I'm still having trouble wrapping my head around this one.
Okay.
How could something as weird as quantum mechanics be connected to our everyday experiences of consciousness? It seems like such a huge leap.
It's definitely a mind-bending idea. Some proponents of quantum theories, they point out that classical physics has really struggled to explain, the subjective experiential aspects of consciousness, that what its likeness. They argue that quantum mechanics, with its emphasis on non-locality, entanglement, and the role of the observer, it might actually provide a more hospitable framework for understanding consciousness.
So they're saying that the strangeness of quantum mechanics might actually be the key to explaining the strangeness of consciousness.
That's the basic idea. Of course, quantum theories of consciousness are highly controversial, and many scientists and philosophers remain pretty skeptical. But it's a fascinating area of exploration, definitely pushing the boundaries of our current understanding.
It's definitely pushing my boundaries. But you know what? I'm starting to appreciate how diverse this whole landscape of consciousness theories really is. It's clear that there's no single right answer, at least not yet.
Absolutely. And that's what makes the study of consciousness so fascinating. It's this frontier of knowledge where philosophers and scientists are, working together, trying to solve one of the greatest mysteries of the universe. Each perspective offers a different piece of the puzzle, but that complete picture, well, it remains elusive.
It's inspiring to think about all the brilliant minds that are like dedicating their lives to understanding this really profound phenomenon. But after this whirlwind tour of theories, I'm feeling, a little bit overwhelmed. How do we make sense of all these different approaches? How do we even know which ones are on the right track and which ones are, leading us astray?
That's the challenge, isn't it? We're faced with this multitude of theories, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, and no clear consensus on which one is correct. It's a bit like being lost in a forest of ideas, unsure of which path to take.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
how do we find our way? What criteria should we use to judge, the success of a theory of consciousness?
That's where the real philosophical work begins, I think.
Mhm.
We need to carefully evaluate the arguments, assess the evidence, consider the implications of each theory. We need to ask ourselves, does this theory actually explain the full range of conscious phenomena?
Hmm.
Is it compatible with what we know about the brain? Does it make testable predictions? And perhaps most importantly, does it actually do justice to the subjective first-person perspective, which is, at the heart of the mystery of consciousness?
Those are all important questions. But even if a theory ticks all those boxes, wouldn't there still be something missing? Wouldn't there still be a gap between, the objective third-person description of consciousness and the subjective first-person experience of it? It's like we can talk about consciousness, analyze it, dissect it, but can we ever truly capture what it's like to be a conscious being from the inside?
That's a question that continues to haunt the study of consciousness, I think. Can we ever fully bridge that gap between the objective and the subjective? Or is there something about conscious experience that will always remain elusive to scientific explanation?
It's a question that takes us back to the heart of the philosophical problem of consciousness. And it's a question that I suspect will continue to drive philosophical inquiry for many, many years to come.
I think you're right. The quest to understand consciousness is far from over. But the journey is, well, it's fascinating. And each step we take, it brings us closer to unlocking the secrets of this most fundamental aspect of our being.
So we've made it. We've journeyed through this massive landscape of consciousness theories, from those metaphysical foundations all the way to the nitty-gritty neural details. My head's kind of spinning with all these different perspectives. But honestly, I'm also feeling this sense of awe at just how complex this whole problem really is.
It is awe-inspiring, isn't it? Consciousness is one of those rare problems that forces us to really confront the limits of our understanding. It pushes us to think creatively, question our assumptions, and explore those boundaries of both science and philosophy.
And for a philosophy enthusiast like me, well, that's pretty exciting. This isn't like a problem with a neat and tidy solution, right? It's an ongoing exploration, this quest for deeper and deeper understanding. And it seems like the more we learn, the more we realize just how much we don't know.
Precisely. The study of consciousness is, well, it's a humbling experience. It reminds us that we're not just these passive observers of the world, but we're active participants in this mystery that we're still trying to unravel.
But where do we even go from here? I
Yeah.
mean, we've encountered all these theories, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, but no clear winner has emerged. So how do we evaluate these theories? How do we determine which paths are even worth pursuing?
That's where the real philosophical work begins, I'd say. It's not enough to just, list out the theories.
Yeah.
We have to engage with them critically, assess their explanatory power, see how they fit with other things we know, and think about whether they lead to testable predictions.
So we need to be discerning, right? We can't just embrace every theory that comes along. We have to apply these rigorous standards of evaluation to figure out which ones are genuinely illuminating and which ones might just be leading us down a rabbit hole.
Exactly. And those standards of evaluation, well, they're themselves a matter of philosophical debate,
Of course.
What criteria should we even use to judge the success of a theory of consciousness? Should it be able to explain, the full range of conscious phenomena, from basic sensory experiences to self-awareness to our sense of free will?
And it should ideally be compatible with what we know about the brain, right? We can't ignore all that incredible progress being made in neuroscience.
Absolutely.
We need to find ways to bridge the gap between those philosophical insights and scientific discoveries.
Totally agree. A good theory of consciousness, it should be grounded in empirical evidence while also, acknowledging those unique challenges of studying subjective experience. It's a delicate balancing act.
It really is.
Yeah.
But even if we did have this theory, one that met all those criteria, wouldn't there still be something missing? Wouldn't there still be that gap between the objective third-person description of consciousness and the subjective first-person experience of it?
Yeah.
It's we can talk about consciousness, analyze it, dissect it, but can we ever really capture what it's actually like to be a conscious being from the inside?
That's the heart of the mystery, isn't it?
It really is.
Can we ever fully bridge that explanatory gap between the objective and the subjective? Or is there something about conscious experience that will always remain just beyond our grasp, resistant to a complete scientific explanation.
It's a question that takes us back to those philosophical foundations we were discussing earlier,
Right.
to those debates about dualism and physicalism,
Yeah.
to the challenges of trying to reconcile the material world with the richness of, subjective experience.
Absolutely. And it's a question that has some pretty profound implications for how we understand ourselves, our place in the universe, and the possibilities of, things like artificial intelligence.
Right.
If consciousness is ultimately reducible to like purely physical processes, then maybe, just maybe, we could create conscious machines.
A wild thought.
It is. But if there's something fundamentally unique about that subjective experience, then the prospect of, artificial consciousness, well, it becomes much more challenging, much more mysterious.
It's a future filled with like all these exciting possibilities, but also some daunting challenges too. And our understanding of consciousness, well, it's going to play a huge role in how we navigate that future.
Absolutely. The more we understand about consciousness, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions about, well, things like the development and deployment of AI, to make sure we create a future that benefits humanity without compromising the very values that make us who we are.
It's a good reminder that philosophy isn't just this like abstract intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
It has real world consequences. It shapes how we think about ourselves, the
Yeah.
world around us, and it really does guide our actions as we grapple with those ethical and societal implications of, all these new technologies.
And as we delve deeper into this mystery of consciousness, we're not just gaining knowledge, right?
Mhm.
We're expanding our capacity for wonder, for awe, and for a deeper appreciation of the incredible complexity of the universe and our place within it.
Well said. This deep dive has been like a truly mind-expanding journey, and I'm sure our listeners feeling the same way. But, it's clear that this is just the beginning of the exploration. There's so much more to discover, to debate, to ponder.
I completely agree. The quest to understand consciousness is an ongoing adventure, and I really encourage our listener to continue exploring all the many paths that lie ahead. Read widely, engage in those thoughtful discussions, and never lose that sense of curiosity that drives us to seek deeper understanding.
That's a perfect note to end on. So to our listener out there, keep questioning, keep wondering, and keep diving deep into those mysteries of the mind. For philosophy enthusiasts like you, well, this is a journey that never truly ends.
Indeed. The exploration of consciousness is a lifelong pursuit, and it's a pursuit that's more than worth the effort.
And that's it for our deep dives into consciousness. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.